come to the table.
Good morning, Pathway. How's everybody doing today?
Good.
Well, some of you are awake this morning. Everybody have a good Thanksgiving?
Yes.
Did you eat too much turkey?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. No, not too much turkey? No. My wife says she didn't have any turkey. She's more of a ham lady, so this is why she chose me. So we're going to talk today about a holiday dinner. In Jewish culture, they had 3 big holidays that they celebrated: Pentecost, the Feast of the Tabernacles, and the Passover. Kind of like the big 3 we have, right? We think about the big 3 where we have meals associated with Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter. All right, so we got this with us. So, and there were traditions that they had, just like we had traditions. We all gather around the table, and you probably got like me. Our family, we gathered around the table. We shared a lot of things. My sister's family came from Indianapolis and brought with them some upper respiratory crud, which they so graciously shared with me. And hopefully, the front row might, well, most of them are related and were there. So sorry, Ashley. So hopefully I won't spit and get that on you, but I appreciate that, And we had all the way from 3, my little nephew Jameson, all the way up to my grandmother who's 102, and she doesn't know she's 102. In fact, she told my wife of how long we've been married, 21 years, that it was nice to meet her. She hopes she has a good semester when she goes back to college. And it made my wife feel very good. Look how young she thinks I am. And I said, honey, she's got dementia. And then there's my other, my other grandma. She's 94. Was talking to my father, who's in his 70s, and my father looks at my grandma and says, "Hey, your Cowboys are on later today." She's a Cowboys fan. She goes, "No, my boys aren't coming today. They're somewhere else." And she goes, "No, your Cowboys are on." He goes, No, my boys, they're with their families today. They'll be here later in the week." She goes, my dad got a little frustrated. "The Cowboys." She goes, "I don't think my hearing aid's working," right? So that was kind of our fun family Thanksgiving, all right? But I want to talk today about this table, this feast that was had. And we know this as the Last Supper, and this is Leonardo da Vinci's portrayal of the Last Supper. Now, he wasn't actually there. Da Vinci wasn't actually there to draw this today. This is not a snapshot. This is not a picture, all right? All right, so in fact, we're going to learn today that probably this drawing of the disciples isn't a very accurate drawing, right? But it's going to give a reference for us to talk about these folks that were there. And as Dave from Sidewalk Prophets, also the lead singer of Sidewalk Prophets is Dave, just like the lead singer of our worship band, a lot in common there. Dave went to Anderson University, not Dave, I don't think Dave Queen, you didn't go, he's not in here, but I don't think he went there, but Dave, we actually lived in the same dorm about 15 years apart, but he called people that are invited to the table a motley crew of misfits. And I think when we think about the disciples, probably a motley crew of misfits is not who we think about. Jesus came down. He was born of the Virgin Mary. We're going to talk about that here in a few weeks when we talk about Christmas. He was born of the Virgin Mary. And then at about the age of 29 or 30, he started to invite people to come to his table, to be his partners in ministry. And I don't know about you, but if it was my job to come down to earth, to pick 12 people to radically change the world forever, I'd probably have some sort of thorough evaluation process. I would hire the best psychologist I know. Luckily for me, I know him because I look at him in the mirror every morning, right? I would get all kinds of other professionals together, and we'd evaluate. We'd say, I want the best that are available. I mean, think about it. If you had to come to earth today and choose the 12 people that you'd want to change the world, you would say, who would be the 12 most influential people? You'd probably get a high-profile athlete, a lot of really other smart people, maybe a politician that everybody likes, and then you realize you can't find a politician that everybody likes. All right, has to be a young politician that hasn't ticked off anybody yet, right? So you would go through this thorough vetting process and pick the most excellent people that you could find that were qualified from the beginning. But the good news for all of us today is that that's not what Jesus did. When he looked at these 12 people that he invited to his table, that he invited to be with him to change the world, he didn't bring people that were already qualified. We're going to learn today that he brought a bunch of people that had a lot of flaws. It was a motley crew of misfits. But what they did do is they accepted his invitation to join him at the table, to help him radically change the world. And in the process, with the exception of one, all of their lives were radically changed. And history is not too kind to that story. In fact, this looks like a series of refined people that most all get along. And, the statues that are made of the 12 disciples, right? They're all these perfectly chiseled men. The paintings that you see in the great cathedrals of Europe are all these elder statesmen who seem like they have it all together. But that's not who it was at all. Each of these 12 had flaws. Each of these 12 had weaknesses. They were ordinary men. And this is good news for me, because I know there are times where I look at my own life and I say, you know what, I have spiritual failings. I have spiritual shortcomings. I'm not qualified to serve. And I'm sure I'm not alone in this. I'm sure each of you could look in the mirror and say, you know what, I'm not sure how God can use me because I do this, I think that, I say this, because this happened to me in the past. But Scripture gives us a great example about how God calls the unqualified. He calls the flawed to bring them to Him, to make them qualified. So let's take a look at the 12 that are at the table pathway. All right, so the first guy here, this is Peter. All right, Peter is known as the Rock, right? That's his nickname. So Dwayne Johnson thinks that, the Rock, for those of you who don't know, the movie star, he thinks he's the one that coined that term. Not true. That was Peter. His nickname was the Rock. But he didn't start out that way. Peter was a very brash man. He's one of these guys that, he was very undependable, right? In fact, what was he told? Does anybody remember what Jesus told him here at this Last Supper? He said, you love me? Yeah, I love you, right? Yeah, in fact, you know what? Before the cock crows 3 times, you're going to deny, or before the cock crows, you're going to deny me 3 times. So in fact, after Jesus was arrested, people said, I don't know that guy. 3 times, right? He was a very brash, undependable individual. He probably was very impulsive. Scripture or historical studies of Peter have showed us that, he was often the first one to jump in when some challenge says, I'm there for you, Jesus, I'm going to help you. But when the going got tough, hey, where's Peter? I don't know, he must be under a rock. I don't know if that's how he got his nickname. He was oftentimes the first one out, but when the going got, or first one in, but when the going got tough, he was also oftentimes the first one out. He was very overeager. Right? You remember when, if you look at the story of when the Roman guards came to arrest Jesus in the garden before they let him off to be tried and crucified. Peter jumped up, he got angry. What did he do? Anybody remember from Scripture what he did? He grabbed the sword and cut a guy's ear off, right? I don't know about you, but if there's like 11 or 12 guys sitting around praying, and all of a sudden this massive soldiers who are well armed come at you, you probably don't want to just like go to the front guy and slice his ear off, right? Because bad things aren't going to happen. So my bet is he sliced his ear off, he got real angry, and then he's like, uh-oh, what do we do now? Luckily, Jesus took that ear and he put it back on the guard, right? So Peter's this guy that very impulsive, very aggressive, very undependable. But Jesus said, Peter, come to my table. He gave him the nickname of the Rock, and he became that rock that actually the church was built on. He began, history tells us, the greatest preacher amongst the original 12. God changed Peter's heart and helped him, and he used Peter to help him change the world. This next guy is Andrew here, all right? Andrew was Peter's brother, and he, along with Peter and James and John, are thought to be the lead group of the disciples. They were the main 4. And he was in the fishing business with his brother Peter. Andrew was more of a behind-the-scenes guy. In fact, Andrew's only mentioned a few times in Scripture. You can count on 2 hands the number of times that he's mentioned in Scripture. There's about 9 times in Scripture where they mention this guy, Andrew. And most of the time, you know what he's known for? This is Andrew, Peter's brother. Right? So that was his main claim to fame, that he was Peter's brother. He lived most of his life in the spotlight of his older brother, Peter. Maybe there's some of us today that we go around, that's what we're known by. We're not known for ourselves. We're known because we're related to somebody. We're knowing that, I know my daughter here is at Kendall, who's not paying attention right now. I know Kendall. Right? I know when she goes to school, she's known as Audrey and Camden's little sister sometimes, right? Yeah, it happens, right? It happens. So he was a behind-the-scenes guy, right? He lived his life in the shadow of his better-known brother. He's a blue-collar guy. He preferred to work behind the scenes. He doesn't appear to want the spotlight. He's overshadowed by his older brother. So you wouldn't think a guy that works behind the scenes would be the kind of guy that Jesus would call. But Jesus said, no, Andrew, come to my table. There's a place at my table for you. He took who Andrew was and used him to help change the world. All right, this is James, the son of Zebedee. All right, James and his brother John, right? They were the sons of Zebedee. And what history tells us is that Zebedee was a pretty prominent figure. He was well known in religious and political circles of the day. Right? And he had these two kids, James and John. They were also fishermen, right? But we think that probably Zebedee and his family were more of the owners of the fishing business that the other guys worked in. So they were a little well-to-do. But that came with it some problems. That came with it some pride. Right? They thought that they deserved a place. And not only did they deserve a place, they deserved a primary place. James, he's also overshadowed by his brother, John. Right? But John is the little brother here. So here's the eldest son from a prominent family. He probably thinks that he deserves to be the lead disciple. In fact, we see many times in Scripture where he and his brother get in an argument over who's the greatest one. No, I'm the best disciple. No, I'm the best disciple. And they start fighting over it. In fact, when we look at the Scripture, when we look at Matthew 20 to 24, not only were they arguing, they talked their mom into going up to Jesus. Jesus says, what do you want? He's like, hey, let me just drop some, let me just say, my two boys, James and John, we're kind of an influential family. Can one of them sit at your right, one of them sit at your left? Can they be the main guys, right? This did not sit well with the other 10 that Zebedee's wife, mama from this family is getting involved and talking about. So they had some pride going on. They also had another nickname. Does anybody know from Scripture what James and John, they were not only the sons of Zebedee, does anybody know what their nickname was? They were the Sons of Thunder, right? And they were not like an early tag team wrestling, thing that got this thing Sons of Thunder. They were given the nickname Sons of Thunder because they had a bad temper, right? In fact, there was one time that Jesus and his band of disciples were traveling and they were getting some opposition from some of the locals. And you know what they said? I said, well, let's love on them until they accept us. James and John said, Let's call fire down from heaven, Jesus. I saw you turn water into wine. I see you do this other thing. Let's burn those people up. Wouldn't that be cool? It might have been cool, but that's not the way Jesus rolled, right? Jesus said, no, we're going to love on them. So James, full of pride, hot temper. But Jesus said to James, there's a place at my table for you. Come with me. Help me to change the world. And in that process, Jesus changed James' heart. And then we got John, right? This is John. And he's probably the guy that history does not portray well, right? So Leonardo da Vinci, in the Last Supper here, he's kind of portrayed as this very peaceful, effeminate-looking guy. And but what we know is it's not accurate. He was just like his older brother James, very brass. He was right there calling down with the temper. Wanted to burn these people up with fire from heaven, right? He had a bad temper. He had a lot of pride, right? He was right there pushing his mom into trying to argue with Jesus about how they should be sitting at his right and sitting at his left. Prideful, arrogant, bad temper, thinking he deserved a good place at the table, right? Rough, tumble guy. Jesus took him and said, please, John, come to my table. In fact, we know a lot about John because John wrote a lot of our New Testament, right? He wrote John, he wrote 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, he wrote Revelation. In fact, he's thought by many to be the elder statesman of the church. And one of the nicknames that he got was actually the disciple of love because he talked about love so much. And that's not the guy that we think about, the guy that wanted to call fire down from heaven to burn people up. The guy that thought that he deserved a place at the table closer to Jesus than anybody else. But Jesus said, John, come sit at my table. Accept my invitation to come sit at my table and help me change the world. And in the process, John's heart was changed to be a son of thunder to a son of love. A person with a fiery, fierce temper to a person that probably told us more about love than anybody else. All right, then we got Philip. All right, Philip was also a fisherman. A lot of fishermen in this group, and all we know about Philip comes from the Gospel of John. And Philip was one of your classic process people. He went by the book. He was kind of like the disciple bean counter. Now, Judas Iscariot was the treasurer of the disciples. We'll get to him later. Right? We saved him from last because he really screwed up. Right? But Philip was the bean counter, right? He was the process person. He's the one that always wanted to follow the rules. And he was always the one that whenever you brought a great idea, I don't think we can do that. No, I just don't see how it's feasible. In fact, when they were confronted, remember the story of feeding 5,000 or probably 20,000 people there when you start talking about wives and kids. Back in the day, they just counted men. I don't know. Maybe they knew the Sunday Pathway was going to have a progressive dinner that men were excluded. So they said, you know what? We'll get you back. We'll just count the men here at this thing. All right? So there were like 20,000 people there. And, Jesus challenged Philip. He goes, Philip, how are we going to feed all these people? It's like, can't happen. Not going to happen. I've calculated even if we had 200 denarii, which is 200 days' wages, that wouldn't be enough to give even a person by. I just don't know how we're going to do it. Right? So he's that guy that every meeting, right, Jesus was like, here's what I want to do. Phil's like, I just don't see how we can make that work in our budget. I just think that's a bad idea. It might scare people away. Don't think that's going to work. And granted, this is after he was watching Jesus do miracles. Right? He early on in Jesus' ministry, when Philip first came, he saw everything was impossible. Right? He saw nothing he saw as possible. But Jesus took this bean counter, took this by the book, rule following guy, and said, Philip, come to my table. There is a place at my table for you. And not only did Philip help Jesus change the world, but in the process, Philip's heart was changed. Philip went from thinking that all things were impossible to all things were possible. Then we got Bartholomew. And some places in the Bible they call him Bartholomew, and other places they call him Nathaniel. And we think that the scripture or history tells us that Bartholomew was probably Philip's best friend. They hung out a lot. And we think that Bartholomew was a student of Scripture. They followed John the Baptist around, and they studied the Old Testament Scriptures very well, and they knew that there was a Messiah coming. And we're told in Matthew that Philip, who was from the town of Bethesda, right? He had met and he figured out that Jesus was the Messiah, right? So what are you going to do? If you find out that this thing has been coming, you knew it was going to happen someday, and you found out it is happening now, wouldn't you want to tell your best friend? Right? Today we probably get on and, we text our best friend and then we tweet it out, hashtag I figured out who the Messiah was, right? Or something like that. So he went and he found Bartholomew, right? Or Nathaniel. I don't know which one. Andrew Perfude, he probably had some nickname that he called his buddy. Well, he went to him, he goes, we found the one Moses wrote about in the law and about who the prophets wrote, or who the prophets also wrote. It is Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. Well, instead of Bartholomew saying, fantastic, I'm glad we found him, you know what he said? Nazareth? Right? That's just not going to happen. Nothing good can come from Nazareth. And it wasn't some sort of theological argument. That's not where Scripture says that the Messiah is going to come from. It's that Nazareth was on the wrong side of the tracks. It was a rough place, a lot of hooligans from Nazareth, right? It was kind of that place you look down on. He was prejudiced. Bartholomew was prejudiced. He said, there's no way anything can come from there that's good. He was bigoted and prejudiced. But Jesus took this person that was prejudiced against his people and said, Bartholomew, there is a place at my table for you. Bartholomew joined. He accepted the invitation to the table. Not only did Bartholomew help Jesus change the world, but his prejudiced heart was changed. It was changed to a heart that could love everybody. Then we got Matthew. This is one of my favorite stories when we look at the calling of the disciples. Matthew was one bad dude, right? In fact, Danae this week was having her devotions, I was out getting my cup of coffee. It was like the one day this week she actually got up before me, and she wasn't rolling out of bed at like 8:59. It's your first patient at 9. Right? I'm in trouble later, right? So anyway, no, she's out there. She's reading the book of Matthew, and I said, hey, man, Matthew was one bad dude. So I gave her like half the sermon right there, so you can like nod off for the next 3 minutes while I'm talking about this guy. Does anybody know what Matthew did as a trade? He was not a fisherman. He was a tax collector, all right? And no one likes the word taxes, except maybe Congress, right? Right? But no one likes the word tax. And here's how taxes worked in that day, right? So in that day, the world was under Roman rule, or at least they were under Roman rule. But people from that culture, they bought franchises from the Roman government. And it was their job to actually collect the taxes, right? And they kept a little bit for themselves and sent the rest back to Rome. And they weren't nice about it. They're like, excuse me, I think you owe your taxes. Whenever you can pay it, that's fine. Just fine me, you know me. No, they set out thugs to collect it. They were very vicious in their collection practices, right? They were outcasts. Tax collectors were social outcasts. They padded their pockets, but no one liked them. In fact, the only time you talk about, you read scripture and you talk about tax collectors hanging out with people and who their friends were, it was called the tax collectors and other sinners, right? No one liked the tax collectors. They were not liked in synagogues. They were banned from going to church. That's how bad they were. You cannot come to our church, right? They had betrayed their culture. No one in the culture liked them, right? They hung out with the other sinners. So who does Jesus choose when he comes to earth as one of his key 12 to help change the world? This horrible sinner who no one liked. Glad he knew what he was doing. He said, Matthew, come to my table. There's a place at my table for you. He took this vile guy that was greedy and just wanted to line his pockets, who didn't care if people didn't like him. He used him to change the world. And in the process, he changed Matthew's heart. Well, we got Thomas, right? Thomas has the nickname of Doubting Thomas because, he's down here at the end. He would not believe that Jesus had actually been resurrected until he stuck his hands in the wounds, right? It's probably, when we look at history, it's probably fair to say that Thomas was somewhat of a negative person. He was a worrywart. He was a brooder. He tended to be anxious and angst-ridden, right? He was a nervous Nelly, right? He was like Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh. Oh, I guess, right? So, he was a pessimist. He was moody. He tended to see the worst in every situation, right? I hope Philip and Thomas, didn't have Philip say, I'm not sure we can do that with our current budget situation. Like, oh no, we're going to go broke. We're going to go broke, right? He was going to worry about it, right? But Jesus took Thomas, this insecure, angst-ridden, moody individual, and said, Thomas, there's a place at my table for you. Come with me. Help me to change the world. Thomas accepted that invitation. And not only did Thomas help Jesus to change the world, but Jesus changed Thomas's heart. He took this Eeyore-ish, moody, anxious guy and turned him into someone that had the confidence of Christ. Next we have James, nicknamed the Less, right? Would you like that to be your nickname, the Less, right? So there's a couple James, so we gotta differentiate the two James. So Scripture tells us that this guy is James the Less, right? We probably think that he was a small guy. He didn't stand out from the crowd. In fact, James was one of the most common names of the day, much like it is today, right? So calling James the Less would be like saying Little Jimmy today. Oh, there's Little Jimmy. Again, you kind of don't know, he's kind of floating, he's that kid at your Thanksgiving dinner that's just kind of floating, behind people at the table, and you think, oh, there goes Little Jimmy. You really don't think too much, about him, right? He was not the kind of person who stands out, right? He was utterly obscure. He demonstrated no leadership. He asked no critical questions, right? There is no record in Scripture of him asking anything of Jesus, of him answering any Jesus questions. So he didn't ask the right questions. He didn't provide the right answers. He had no unusual insight. But Jesus said to James, he said, Little Jimmy, there's a place at my table for you. He used this obscure, quiet man to help change the world. Then we got our other Simon, Simon the Zealot, right? And Simon the Zealot came from a political party known as the Zealots, right? And the Zealots were this radical political party. They studied the law, they knew the law, and they were radical in enforcing the law. And they advanced, they hated the Roman government, right? And they advanced their agenda primarily through terrorism and acts of violence. They were extremists in every sense. So basically, we got a political terrorist who hated the Romans. Right? Now, we think that maybe Simon joined Jesus for political reasons, for political motivation, right? But Jesus looked at this terrorist, he looked at this violent guy whose heart may not have been right, and said, Simon, there is a place at my table for you. Simon accepted that invitation, helped Jesus to change the world, and in the process, he had his heart changed. How do we know his heart was changed? Well, we know that one of the disciples that he traveled with frequently to spread the gospel was Matthew. Matthew, a tax collector who represented the Roman government, hung out and worked with and advanced the gospel with Simon, the terrorist, who hated the Roman government. These two worked together. He changed both of their hearts to work together. He accepted his invitation, and in the process, he was changed. And then we got Judas, not Iscariot, right? This is the guy who unfortunately had the same name as the disciple who had the same name as the guy who, goes down all history as being the bad guy, right? He's also referred to as Thaddeus in Scripture. He was likely a very tender-hearted, compassionate, gentle guy, very sweet-spirited. He was humble and filled with hope for the world. So he's very different from all these other guys. He wasn't brash. He wasn't outspoken. He was very quiet. He was very compassionate, very humble. How would he fit in with these other guys? I don't know, but somehow Jesus did. He said Thaddeus. He said Judas. Whatever, I don't know which one Jesus called him most often. He said, come, there's a place at my table for you. He invited Judas, and Judas worked together with these other individuals who were very different from him. And then we got Judas Iscariot, right? He's the one that betrayed Jesus, that led up to Jesus' death. He was the treasurer, was probably pilfering money from them. He accepted Jesus' invitation to come to the table, but he did not allow his heart to be changed by Jesus. He really didn't realize the error of his ways till later, and he actually ended up, killing himself because of his guilt over what happened. He didn't allow his heart to be changed. But Jesus invited him to his table and showed his compassion and love. Jesus was God. He was all-knowing. He knew that that was the guy that was going to betray him, but he still invited him to the table. He demonstrated love to this person that would ultimately lead to his death. What a great example for us. Even people we know who are going to do us wrong, we still can demonstrate some love toward them. Right? So, we got these arrogant, greedy, prideful, terroristic, all of these flaws. Jesus brought this band of misfits together and said, come with me, come to my table, help me to change the world. What a great example for each of us here this morning. He called each of these ordinary men to the table. Maybe my clicker just stopped working. Is there another? There we go. All right. He called each of these ordinary men to the table, right? In spite of, and probably because of, all of their flaws, right? Jesus took these flawed people to help him change the world. He did not say, I would like to have you join me someday, but you have to get your life in order first. He didn't say, I see some potential into you, but let me see if you realize that potential until you come to my table. No, he said, come to my table, join me, help me change the world. These men accepted his invitation, and in the process, their own personal lives were changed as well. Will you accept his invitation to the table? Don't say, I'm not good enough. Don't say, God only wants the perfect. Because frankly, no one meets that standard. Humanly speaking, no one qualifies when the standard is utter perfection. Jesus is the only one that was ever perfect. We're told in Romans that all have sinned and fallen short of the God, that there's none that are righteous, not even one. Right? It's Paul, who had a pretty rough life before he was converted as well, that he called himself the worst of sinners, who nothing good dwells in. There are no intrinsically qualified people. God himself must save the sinners and then transform them into the instruments that he can use. These 12 were like the rest of us. They were selected from the unworthy and the unqualified. And as the band comes up, you know, we realize that we're thinking that, do I need to get my life in order before I accept this call? No. That'd be like someone knowing that they're having a heart attack and say, well, let me get my cardiac situation stabilized before calling 911. That's not what we need to do. Don't say I have too much of a temper. I can't join him at the table. Don't say I drink too much. I can't join him at the table. Don't say I've engaged in some shady business practices. I can't join him at the table. Don't say I watch the wrong kind of movies or I look at the wrong kind of things online. I can't join him at the table. I've used words that God wouldn't approve of. I can't join him at the table. I've screwed up too many times. I can't join him at the table. I'm someone that lives behind the scenes. No one would notice me. I can't join him at the table. Don't use those excuses. He is extending the invitation to you today to join him at the table. He doesn't want you to be perfect before you come. He wants you to come to his table to help him change the world today. And in the process, he's going to change your heart and mold it after his heart. Maybe there are some of you today that have never heard that he's inviting you to his table. And if that's you today, we're going to extend an invitation just a little bit to accept his invitation. Or maybe there are those of you that have heard the invitation before, you've accepted the invitation, but you would like to move it forward. You'd like to maybe start serving in Pathway. You'd like to find some ways that you can start working for his kingdom. You say, you know what, I'm too screwed up to help out. No, you are not. Pastor Ryan mentioned the Grow Track that we're going to be going through next week. We're going to look at and we're going to study each of your individual strengths. We all have them. We're going to study each of your gifts. We all have them. And learn how God can take you to help further his kingdom. Please pray with me. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for the great example that you provide us in Scripture of how you qualify the unqualified. You call the unworthy. You use those who may think they're useless to help transform the world. And with every head bowed and every eye closed, maybe there's some of you sitting here today that say, you know what? I've been waiting too long to join him at the table. I realize that I want to accept the invitation. I want to become a Christian. I want to be a follower of Christ. And if so, please pray this prayer with me. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for your invitation. I know I'm not perfect, but I'm committed to change. And I know I can't fully change unless you help me make that change. Lord, please come into my life. Please save me from my sin. If you're praying that prayer today, will you just let me know by the raise your hand? No one look around. Thank you. Band, play for us.